In this video, we're going to calculate something called the discriminant, and we're going to see what the discriminant tells us about the solutions for a quadratic equation. So the discriminant is the part of the quadratic equation, the quadratic formula that is under the square root. So the discriminant is equal to b squared minus 4ac. And of course you want to have 0 on the other side, just like you do when you're using the quadratic formula. So we're going to look at this chart here. There's a similar chart found in the book, but this is going to show us the possibilities. There's 4 possibilities for the discriminant and different kinds of solutions for each. And then we're also going to look at what the graphs look like for each of those types. We're going to see more about graphs in section 8.3 as well. So the first possibility is that when you calculate b squared minus 4ac, you get a positive number that is a perfect square. So if that's the case, then the solutions are 2 real, rational solutions. And rational means that they are either whole numbers or fractions, no roots in the answer. And the reason that happens is because in the quadratic formula, if b squared minus 4ac is a positive perfect square, you would take the square root of that number, and then that makes the square root go away. And so, like we saw back in example 1, we have a situation where we had a perfect square. When we took the square root, we got 2 answers that were fractions, but there were no roots in the answer. What that's going to look like on the graph is the number of solutions refers to the number of times the graph crosses the x-axis. So these are all going to be parabola shapes, and if it's 2 real rational solutions, that means that the parabola is going to cross the x-axis in 2 places, right here, and those are going to be either at whole numbers or it could be at fractions, but again, it's not going to be something with a square root. So the second possibility is that b squared minus 4ac is positive and not a perfect square. And if that happens, then there are 2 real irrational solutions. And they're irrational solutions because they contain a root. So if the part under the square root, when you're doing the quadratic formula, is not a perfect square, then you still have a square root in your answer, like some of the other problems that we saw earlier. And if that's the case, we say that the solutions are irrational. You can get a decimal approximation for them, but you can't simplify them to a whole number or a fraction without a root. And again, if there are 2 solutions, I wish I could draw these lines a little bit straighter. If there are 2 solutions, that means that the parabola is going to cross the x-axis in 2 places. And in this case, they're not going to be at whole numbers because the solutions are irrational, so it would be kind of a decimal approximation where you would plot those points. So b squared minus 4ac, if it is positive, then you have to look at if the number is a perfect square or not. If it is a perfect square, 2 real rational solutions. Not a perfect square, 2 real irrational solutions. Third possibility is that b squared minus 4ac could equal 0. And if that's the case, then you're going to have 1 repeated real rational solution. And the reason for that is because you would be taking the square root of 0 in the quadratic formula. Square root of 0 is 0, plus 0 minus 0. Either way, you would have the same whatever number it is. So the plus minus, if it's plus minus 0, then you're only going to actually have one solution there. What that's going to mean about the parabola shape is that it's going to just touch the x-axis and then go back up. So your graph would look like that. It would only cross the x-axis at that one point, which is going to be at the bottom of the parabola. Or we'll see next time that's called the vertex. The last possibility is that b squared minus 4ac is negative. If it's negative, we have two imaginary solutions. So if we're taking the square root of a negative number, then we have to use the I, like we saw again in the earlier examples, and so that means that those are what are called imaginary solutions, because we're using the imaginary number I when we write the answer. In terms of the parabola, what that means is that the parabola does not ever cross the x-axis, and so there are no real solutions, but there are two what are called imaginary solutions. So those are the four possibilities for what could happen when you calculate b squared minus 4ac. And so we're going to look at example 4. It says for each equation, compute the discriminant, then determine the number and types of solutions. So what we have to do first is identify our a, b, and c, just like with the quadratic formula. And then we're going to plug into just b squared minus 4ac, not the whole quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula tells us what the solutions actually are. The discriminant just tells us some information about the solutions, but not what x is actually equal to. So b squared is going to be 4 squared minus 4 times a times c. And just like with the quadratic formula, I'm going to simplify this. Again, we have a minus and then a minus here. That's going to change to plus. That'll be 12 times 5, which is 60. And 16 plus 60 is 76. So the answer for the first part, compute the discriminant, is 76. On my math lab, this is going to be a two-part question. So first you're going to have to enter that number. Once you do that, then they'll pop up with some multiple choices for what that tells you about the number and type of solutions. So 76 is positive. It's a positive number. And it's not a perfect square. So looking at my chart, if b squared minus 4ac is positive and not a perfect square, there are two real, irrational solutions. And so on the multiple choice page, that would be the choice that I would choose. Next, we're going to look at part B. First, we're going to identify A, B, and C. Again, we want to have 0 on one side, which in this case, all three of these examples, I already have that. So, but just make sure A, B, and C. Plug into b squared minus 4ac. B is negative 6. Be careful with squaring the negative here. That's going to make a positive. 4 times A times C. So negative 6 squared, negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36. And then 4 times 9 times 1 is 36. 36 minus 36 is 0. So if the discriminant is 0, then that tells me that there is 1 repeated. I'm using the exact same language that you'll see on my math lab here to be consistent. 1 repeated real rational solution. So that's the answer for that part. Lastly, part C, same idea. Have 0 on one side, identify A, B, and C, plug in 2b squared minus 4ac. Again, negative value for b, that when I square it, it will become positive. So negative 8 squared is positive 64, minus 4 times 3 times 7, which is 84. Yep. 64 minus 84 is negative 20. So if it's negative, it doesn't matter if it's a perfect square or not a perfect square. If it's negative, you have two imaginary solutions. So what you should do next is look at checkpoint problem number 4. One thing I want to point out, for a, there's no number in front of x squared. That means that a is 1. So make sure that you're plugging that in accordingly. Do these in your notes, check your answer with the notes that are posted, and then move on to the homework.